Welcome to this session on CSS frameworks. We're going to be covering the nuts and bolts side, so project setup. We're going to be installing Sass and configuring Sass correctly. We're also going to be installing Bootstrap and doing some customization to demonstrate how all of these things work together. This is intended to get over any problems with structure or with setting the project up in the first place. This is not going to directly help you with the CA as such, but I'm going to go through all of these processes from scratch, and we can go through it slowly, and I'll try and explain everything as I go. So the first thing I'll say is that I'm going to be doing everything in the terminal. I actually want to close that because I haven't created my folder yet. So I'm going to open a new folder, and I'm going to say CSS frameworks CA. It's probably what you're going to be calling your project. So open that one, and now when I open the terminal, you can see that I'm in the correct folder. I think one of the issues that students ran into was that they were running these commands, the commands were working correctly, but they were outputting to the wrong folder. So it seems a little bit confusing at that point. So if you open the VS Code terminal, it's always going to open at your top level folder that you've selected. And we can test that by creating a new file. And in here, just typing ls, which means list. And we see we have one file and it matches the one we've just created. Okay, so now we are happy we're in the right place. We can do the first thing, which is setting up the package.json file. So if you want to, you can create this from scratch. It would just be a case of creating a new file, calling it package.json, and then you have an object here and you'd have stuff like scripts and whatnot. But this is not a good idea because this file is automatically generated by npm, and it's much better and quicker to let this tool do it for us. So there's two ways to do this. You can either do it the quick way, which is what I suggested in the lesson, which is init, npm init with the Y flag, which means basically say yes to everything. And if we run that, we can see our package file. So what this file is that it is meant to describe our software package. So in this case, our software package is going to be a social media application. So this is not describing Bootstrap, it's not describing Sass, this is describing our work. So that means that we can call it whatever we want as long as it's lowercase with hyphens. And we can give it a description. We can ignore this main file. It's not important to us at this stage. So if we want to, we can even delete that because it's really irrelevant. We have the scripts block here that we will get back to in a second. And then this stuff is to keep track of who the package belongs to, the licenses, whether it's open source or what kind of open source license it has. In general, unless you're creating the next Wikipedia, you're probably not going to worry about the license too much. But if you get a moment, it's worth reading a summary of the different licenses that are available. So this is the quick version, and if I delete this and run it the other way, which is npm init without any flag, so I'm not typing npm init y, the command line is then going to step through a series of questions and give suggestions. So package name, I might call this social media app, and then version, I'll say this is going to be an early version, so 0.01 is fine for me. Social media app demo for Noroff. Entry point we can ignore, test command we can ignore. Git repository, I will come back to that and add the repo once I've created the repo, which I've not done at this point. Keywords, I'll say social media, Bootstrap, Sass. Author is going to be my name or an alias if you prefer. And then in square brackets, you can put your email address so that anyone in the future will know that you are the creator. And once it's been through all the questions, I'm okay with all of them, so I'm going to hit yes. And I've now created my slightly more detailed package file. it does the same thing. It just now is slightly more helpful to anyone who is going to be approaching this project from the outside. So for example, your teacher who's marking your project, or a collaborator in the future, or maybe you pass the project on to someone else in the future. All of these people will appreciate the fact that you've put a little bit of effort into describing your project here. Okay, so now we've got this set up. That enables us to do two important things. The first thing is that we can now install packages using npm install. And the second thing is that we can start adding to this scripts section with our own custom scripts, which is going to be important. To begin with, let's install Sass. So we're going to say npm I, or install, and then D for development dependencies, dev dependencies. So if you don't include this, it'll go into regular dependencies. If you do include D, it'll go into dev dependencies. The difference between these two things is that a dependency is something, a file that you need to actually be on your website when the user is visiting. So for example, if you have a library that formats currency, like you give it a digit and it will turn it into a nicely formatted currency string, your user needs that on the front end. So that has to be a regular dependency. But with something like Sass or live server, the user doesn't need that. The only person who needs that is the developer who's working on the project at that time. And so this is why we split them apart. It's actually to save space, to cut down on the size of the JavaScript file that the user has to load in the end of the process. So that's why we're going to be installing Sass with D. And whilst we're here, we can also install live server in the same command if we want to. We could do that in two separate commands. But since we're already installing things, I'm just going to list Sass and live server. And when I hit enter, it's going to fetch all of the package data from the npm registry, and it's going to clone these projects into my node modules folder. Okay, and some of you have noted that there's this audit message saying that there's 3 high severity vulnerabilities. So what this is something called npm audit. An npm audit is a safety mechanism to look through the packages that you're installing and make sure that there's nothing that might be of concern. So sometimes there's a bug or there's a mistake that is included in a package, and it can be an opportunity for a hacker to exploit a system. So these exploits get listed in a central registry, and this shows up on our terminal, which is great because if we're making like an application for a bank, or if we're handling important data, we would want to be 100% sure that there was no vulnerabilities in our code. So for our purposes, we're only going to be running this on our local machine. It's not such an issue. None of these vulnerabilities are going to carry through to the user because they're not vulnerabilities in Bootstrap. They're vulnerabilities in our dev dependencies. So in this particular instance, we can ignore this. However, it is the job of the owner of the live server repository to fix these, and I understand that that is underway at the moment. So this will be updated in a few weeks' time to a new version, perhaps 1.2.3, and with that new version, these vulnerabilities should be resolved. So for anyone wondering what that means or if they should worry about it, you should be aware of it. But in this case, it's not important to us. So if we check our package file, we can now see that we have a new heading called dev dependencies, and we have live server, and we have Sass installed. So before we add to the scripts, yep, there we go. Before we add to this script section, I'm going to do a little bit of project file structuring. So I'm going to create a new folder called source. Source is the conventional place to house your source code, and dist is the conventional place to house your distribution code. And the difference is that the distribution code is what your user is going to be accessing when they view your website. that's the JavaScript file and the CSS file that they're going to be hitting. Whereas your source files represent the files that you work with during development. And then once you've built those files, they are then ready for distribution. So you wouldn't want your user to be using unbuilt files because they may be much larger. Sometimes they can be like 5 or 10 times larger in file size. And they may not be compatible with the browser. That's the other issue, is that they might be using a different version of JavaScript and that doesn't run on the browser. So to eliminate these issues, we run user content from dist, and when we're developing, we're working in the source folder. So I've got my source folder. Inside the source folder, I'm going to have SCSS. If you want to, you can call this Sass. Personally, I find it a little bit irritating that this project seems to have 2 different names, and I prefer the SCSS syntax, so that's why I'm using SCSS. And the file I'm going to create, I could call it anything. So some good candidates would be index.scss or styles.scss, perhaps app.scss. It doesn't really matter as long as it makes sense to you and it makes sense to someone else who's going to be looking at the project. So I'm going to go with more conventional styles.css, SCSS. And inside here, I'm just going to make a very simple style, test, and display none. And maybe just to demonstrate some of the SCSS features, I'm getting tongue-tied here. We could have test button. I'm just putting random styles in here to demonstrate the syntax more than anything else. In fact, let's put a variable. Sorry, that's my bad. Okay. So we have a very simple SCSS file to demonstrate nesting and variable use. I don't need this anymore. Oops. What am I doing here? Don't need this. Okay. So now we're ready to talk about scripts. And the first script we're going to want to add, if you want to, you can remove this test command. I'm just going to leave it there because I'm not going to use it. So we're going to have a build command, and this is going to invoke Sass. So it's effectively whatever we write here, it's running it in our command line. We're writing like a command line shortcut here. So it's Sass, and then we want to add our input directory, which is source/SCSS, because that's where our SCSS files are going to be housed. And then we have a colon, and we have our output directory, which we're going to put as dist.css. And one of the confusing things about this is that we're referring to a folder that doesn't exist. It's not in the project. So if we're trying to link to it, if we went to the index file and we tried to add a link here to dist, it doesn't exist. So there's no way for VS Code to find out what files are available. And at this point, it's tempting just to sort of go into node modules and grab the first CSS file you can find, but we need to wait. So we're going to delay this for now. Instead, we are going to run the build command once. So npm run build. And now we can see that that folder has appeared. And we have 2 files. We have our CSS file, which has done the tasks that we asked. And we have a map file, which is for the browser. So you don't need to ever view these map files. They're just there to assist the browser. Okay, so we're happy that that script is now working. The watch script is very, very similar. If you prefer, you could call this start instead of watch. But I'm calling it watch because it's specifically using the watch flag. And this on its own, so if I run that now, npm npm run watch, it will begin watching for changes. And in fact, if I add change here, you can see that it's recompiled, and if I come in here, it's changed the output, which is great. But this isn't going to show us anything on the screen because we haven't connected it to HTML and we're not running a live server. So the next thing to do would be to come in here, and now we can see our dist folder is available, CSS styles.css. If we were to run live server now, we could use the browser extension. I have it installed. Lots of people have it installed by default when they're developing. However, this is the purpose of the package file. The package.json file is to allow for a package to be portable. So you can give it to someone else and they can install it and start working with it without having to install an extension or install this software on their computer. It should run completely within the environment of VS Code. So that's why it is generally better to include these extra tools in the package.json file, even if it's not a core part of your app, i.e. it's not necessary for the user. If it's still necessary for the developer, it probably should be in package.json. So that is why we installed the live server dependency here. And what I'm going to do here is just add this to the end, live server. This and symbol, you can see that there's two here and there's one here. They both mean and, but they are different types of and. So this is serial, as in sequential. So this command will run, and then once that command has finished running, this command will run after that. And this other and, where there's just one of them, this is parallel. So this command will run at the same time that this will run, which means that when we exit this and npm run watch again, two things are going to happen. The Sass watcher is going to run, and also I'm going to see my document in the browser. And if I put an H1 there, we can see that it is reloading, and if I make a style that is relevant, font size not very exciting, color red. So everything is hooked up. It is refreshing. This is the basic setup for Sass. So you don't need anything else. If you're not going to use a framework, you don't have to use a framework. If you want to build your project from scratch, I'm not saying for the CA, you do need to use Bootstrap for the CA, but in general, if you're using Sass, it doesn't mean you have to use Bootstrap. You can use whatever tool you want. But this is the minimal setup for the system. And the next thing I'm going to show you before we go on to Bootstrap stuff is the git ignore file. So I'm just going to exit this, I'm going to exit the watch command, and I'm going to type git init to create a new repository. And some of you may have noticed that there are thousands of files in here, and they're all inside the node modules folder. We don't need to keep track of all these files. This is just like spam. In fact, this is going to create big problems for us because it's going to increase the time that it takes to clone the repository by a huge amount. So we really don't want these files included in our repository at all. And luckily there is a method or a mechanism to exclude files, which is git ignore. So it's .git ignore. And this will be read by Git, and any files or folders that match items in this file will be excluded. So the first one we want to add is node modules. And if we look at this change panel, we've gone from over 1,000 changes to 7 changes. And I'll just undo that so you can see again. We've got 1,506 changes, and now we have 7 changes. And these are all our files, so these are things that we care about and they're relevant to us. They're not someone else's files from another package. So I'm just going to commit all of this and say Sass setup. At the moment, the way I did this, I created a Git repository locally. I am running Git on my computer, but that Git repository doesn't exist anywhere else. So if my computer broke or if it got destroyed, that whole repository would be destroyed. Whereas when I'm hosting on GitHub, that is never going to happen. So until I'm sort of happy with how my repository is going, I like to hold off pushing it to GitHub because I've got hundreds of repositories. It's hard to keep track of them all. But if I wanted to do that, the easiest way for me would be to hit publish and then give it a name, which in this case is going to be the same name as the folder we're in. And I have the option to publish as a public or a private. So if you go through this process, I'll find the proper documentation for it on the VS Code site. But once you've logged in on your browser, you can then just publish directly to GitHub. So if I do that and let it do its thing, and if you prefer to do it the other way around, where you start with GitHub and clone to your desktop, that's absolutely fine. They do the same thing. But here we have what we've just done there. And now anytime we make a change, if I delete this and commit, so you can see that commit intentional mistake has just showed up on our remote repository. So we have everything set up like it was before. And now we're going to install and implement Bootstrap. So to begin with, we're going to run npm install Bootstrap. And we're not going to include the D tag because we want the user to have access to these files. So we'll do that, and we should see Bootstrap appear in our very long node modules folder here. It's there. And we can see we've got the dist files, and we also have effectively the source files for Bootstrap, which is what we're going to be using. So back in here, we can remove all of these styles, and the first thing we're going to do is import Bootstrap SCSS, and then the main file is called bootstrap.scss. So without doing anything else, if we now run npm run watch, it's very important to remember to actually run your command once you've written it. Many hours have been spent shouting at the code because it's not changing, and I didn't realize that I didn't have the command running, so just double check that. And anyone who's familiar with Bootstrap will know that the fact that this has changed from Times New Roman to the browser default sans serif font means that Bootstrap is in fact running. And if we go to sources in DevTools and we look at our style sheet, it looks pretty much like an exact copy of Bootstrap to me. So very powerful single line there. It's doing a lot. And at this point we could begin styling with Bootstrap, but we don't have any link to the JavaScript, which we need for stuff like modals or for drop downs. So here I'm going to add a script tag, and this is going to reference Bootstrap dist because we want the distribution version of Bootstrap.js. And there's lots of different options here. The one we're going to want to use is bootstrap.bundle.min. The bundle contains Popper and jQuery Lite, so that means we only need one script tag instead of 3. and the min means that it's been minified, i.e. the file size has been reduced by removing unnecessary characters. So if we go to the excellent documentation and go to the examples, we can pull one of these examples. One that would be interactive would be quite nice. Okay, I'm going to pull this one, the checkout form. And hopefully I can just take this and we'll replace that, that there. So anyone asking if you're allowed to copy and paste Bootstrap content, the answer is yes. It's all free and open source, and they almost expect you to copy and paste from their documentation, because that's the quickest way to make sure that you are getting the correct markup. And if there's just one caveat, which is don't copy things completely blindly. So lots of people come here to the cards page and they copy this exactly as it is and start filling out their image and their text and stuff like that. And they tend to leave this style here, which is really only there just to show this demo. This is not like, you're not meant to do this as well. So this catches people out a lot. I see this a lot. So when you are copying, just pay attention to what you're copying, and if there's something that you don't need, you might be able to remove it. Just test it out. If it's something like this, I think it should be pretty clear because it's an inline style. Maybe you should be doing this in SCSS instead. So that's just a little caveat. If we go back to our application here, we can see it's looking pretty good. I don't actually know if I don't think there's any validation on this, and the image is missing because we don't have that image in our project. We could add a nav here just to show some of that JS is actually kicked in. Oops. So let's go up here and put that at the top. And there we have our drop downs, and the fact that this drop down is working indicates to me that that everything, the JavaScript is connected correctly. Okay, so we can commit that as adding markup. We can commit this as installing Bootstrap, and we can commit these as implementing Bootstrap. And now the only real task left, and when I say only real task left, this is the task that should take the longest. The setup side of things shouldn't be the thing that takes a long time. The only thing left is to start building with this. So I'm not going to sit here and build out a whole Bootstrap app. I'm just going to show you some examples of how to customize Bootstrap. So what we're going to do is we'll take a look at the actual package itself. So I'm now going into the Bootstrap directory and node modules, and I'm going to take a look at the SCSS folder. And the main file I'm interested in is this variables file here, because this is where a lot of our color scheme is defined, and this is where stuff like border radius is defined, and padding sizes, gradients and shadows, and just about everything that can be defined in Bootstrap is defined here. So we don't need to override all of this. There's a lot of stuff we're probably not going to be too worried about. So to start off with, let's just take a selection of these variables. So I'm going to open a new file and put that over here. I'm actually going to close the terminal now because we're not going to mess around with the terminal too much. And I'm going to save this file, and it's going to be called variables.scss. So it's going to be, oops, do I already have that? Oh, I'm in the wrong folder. Yeah, so be aware you need to select the correct folder. That is fine. So now in our SCSS folder, we've got styles and we've got variables. And I can now start to move some of these across. I'm just going to move colors across to begin with. The default flag is only, it's only used in Bootstrap. So when you're overriding, you don't want this. So you can do a find and replace. It might be more fun that way than doing it manually. I just hit Command F or Control F is probably what it is for Windows. Popped this down and I just said replace with nothing. So that's just the quick way I use to edit these things in bulk. Now here we can mess around and change some colors, and they're probably going to make no sense now because I'm doing this at random. But this should give us a feel for how sort of quickly we can make changes and see those show up in our project. So we've got our custom colors now, and in here in our main styles file, we're going to import, we're going to import that above because we want to load the variables before we load Bootstrap. It's a little bit confusing that it works that way around to me, but that is the way it works. So, and when you are importing a partial file, you don't need to include the underscore. So if that is correct, if I've done everything correctly, we should see that the colors are kind of weird. We've got purple now instead of blue. Not that much has changed because it's quite a boring page actually that I picked here, but we know that our changes are actually taking effect. So if we go back to the variables page, we can take a look around and see that we've got a lot of color stuff, and we could change what the primary color is. So at the moment it's blue, but we could change that to green or what have you. These switches are options. So if there's something that you've read about in the documentation that you would like to try out or turn off, then you can use these settings to turn them on or off. I'm not going to go into them. I don't typically edit these when I'm working on Bootstrap projects, but some of these might be worth looking into if you are curious. You have your breakpoints here, so this is a useful one. We have border widths, so if you're unhappy with border utility, i.e. like border 1, border 2, border 3, you can change those classes. So that would translate to border 1, border 2, border 3. And there's really, border radius is another one. Some people will want to disable border radius. So to do that, you would, what happened? Okay, it's hard to read. So to disable border radius, I'm going to start off by taking away those default tags again. And then I'll just change these all to 0. Okay, so if we check our application again, we can see that stuff like buttons and pill icons, they no longer have the rounded edge. Same with the input boxes, pretty much everything. We now have a much more angular look to our theme. So just to wrap up here, I shouldn't be editing that. This is the minimum the minimum viable customized Bootstrap setup. So this is the absolute minimum you need to take Bootstrap and start working with it. Over time, you may start accruing your own files for stuff that's not covered by Bootstrap. So for example, you might have like a specific video banner or something that Bootstrap doesn't immediately cater for. And in that case, you would start to create new files. So let's say video banner .scss. You might have like a components folder here. So like components, and then have header.css. So on and so forth. How you structure this is ultimately your choice and your business, but it has to be clear and helpful. That's the aim. You should be able to look at the structure of the folders and read through the names of the folders and have a good idea of what is going to be in each file. And then once we have our styles in these files, border bottom, then we can, in the same way, import components header. We can actually leave off the SCSS file extension if we choose to, because SCSS will assume that if we're importing something, that it is either going to be .scss or .css. So there we have our file, and if we look at the dist file and we go right to the bottom, we can see the last style to be added to our 10,000 line CSS file is this header class that we just added. So this is how you do custom work. This is custom styles, or let's say original styles, and then we have Bootstrap styles, and we have Bootstrap variable overrides. So I think that should give quite a good idea of which direction to go in when building out a Bootstrap project with these tools. I'm going to show you one last thing, which is almost like a cheat code for this process. And I'm going to say that if you do choose to use this, just look carefully at the output. Look carefully at what you get exported from this tool. It's called bootstrap.build. And this is a tool for prototyping Bootstrap themes. So if I open the site, it gives me every single variable with a UI. And if I want to change something about drop-downs, it has all of the values I can change. And as soon as I change it, I will immediately see these changes come through. So for example, alerts, if I go down here and I have, where are alerts? Here. So we've got alerts here, and we could say maybe we don't want border radius for alerts, and then we see that change happen instantaneously. So this site is very, very useful for quick prototyping or just getting a sense of how something's going to look without going through the full setup. But you ultimately want to use this top method. So you could export it as like a compiled CSS file, but if you do that in the CA, you're not going to get a good grade, because we're looking for you to use SCSS overrides. We're not looking for you to use the easy way out here. So if you are using this tool, select this option, and that will effectively give you a predefined, where did I put this? A predefined file. Oops, no, that's correct. There we go, replace. And now if we look at our variables file, the only thing I changed was border radius. So that's the only thing in that export file. So this is meant to assist you. It's meant to be like a companion, but ultimately the work still happens in SCSS. You're still using a variables file, and the tool is just there to make life a little bit easier for you. So I'm going to commit these remaining changes. Examples. I'm going to create a new branch. I should have been doing this on a branch already. I shouldn't really have been working on master, but I didn't mean to demonstrate too deeply into that side. So we're going to create a branch called like submission or something like that, and I'll just add a extra style somewhere, like primary is red. So we've made one change, or three changes effectively, because it's also updated the map files, and add those and say updated variables. So now we have two branches that are different from each other. And if we go to our repository, we can see submission had recent pushes less than a minute ago, compare and pull request. We can also see here that we have two branches. We have master, which is default, and we have submission, which is the branch we just created a second ago. So if we click on this button, or if we click on this button here, they're going to do the same thing. So when let's imagine that this submission branch contains like your finished work. There's 3 pages. It's all looking great. It's all finished. You're happy. You want it to go to the teachers for review. You hit this button. You create a pull request. Give us a little description of the project or what is included. It's conventional to sort of keep this quite short and sweet. So changes, if this was representing changes, you'd say changes include, and then have a list of A has been changed to B and stuff like that. But in this case, it's just going to be a description of the project because it contains all of the work that you're committing. So pull request is going to be my finished submission. Please review a social media site. Create pull request. And now this page here is the link that we want to have access to. So this is going to show us everything that's changed. So for example, this extra line being added here is the change that we made. But for you, you're going to have lots more files in here because this will be your whole project instead of just these 3 files. These are the only 3 files that are different to the other branch, so that's why we're not seeing them in the same way. So once you've created this pull request, that's the end of that process. We're then going to review it. So I would go in here as a teacher and I would hit review changes. I would look through all of the files. I would clone the repository. I'd run the repository and read through the code. And then if there's problems, I'll write in here. If something's very good, I'll write in here. Let's just say an example problem, like so primary color should be purple, not blue, not red. So start a review, and I'm going to say border radius should be 2 pixels. Okay, finish my review, submit, and now you would see this. You would see the comments, and it will select the code that's relevant. And in order to resolve these comments, you would then need to go and make the change that's been suggested in the comment. So I'm expecting that almost everyone is going to have feedback. And the reason I'm expecting that is because even as professional developers, when we go through this process, we always have feedback. It's very, very rare to have a pull request where you do everything perfectly, you don't make a mistake somewhere, or you don't overlook something somewhere. So typically speaking, a pull request will not just be approved first time round. There probably will be some problem with it somewhere. And we are wanting to build this into the process of submission so that it's not like, you lose 5 points because you missed something in the instructions. If you miss something in the instructions like that, that'll be in your review. So you will have the ability to address that problem before you get your grade.